Welcome to SHOWstudio, London Fashion Week, and we're here to talk about the Ashish show. We've never done an Ashish panel before, so it's very exciting. There's lots of different things we can discuss. I think it'd be nice to talk about London Fashion Week in general and what's been going on, but also focus on this very special designer's work and collection. But before we dive into our discussions, I'll let my fabulous set of panellists who've taken a break from the shows to come join us at our studio and introduce themselves, starting with you, Katie.
Hi, so I'm Katie Barron and I'm a journalist and an author and the head of retail at innovation and trends business stylist.com.
Morning, I'm Dilys Williams. I'm the director at Centre for Sustainable Fashion.
Morning, I am Tamsin Blanchard. I'm a journalist and fashion features director at Tank magazine.
Very impressive set of panellists with me today. It's quite intimidating. I'd like to talk a little bit. When we always send out, an invitation to our panellists and say, would you come in? What do you want to talk about? And you guys came back and said, we'd like to do Ashish, and I'm interested in why. Dilys, is he a designer that has struck your fancy from a sort of sustainability perspective? Talk to me about.
Yes, absolutely. And this show, obviously more than any other before, but his whole take on the notion of connectedness, this idea about mixed identities, about us all living well together, is really for me what sustainability is about. I mean, sustainability is obviously about the material stuff, it's about kind of being careful with resources, but absolutely for fashion, it's about a cultural identity that's a sort of shared sense of togetherness and diversity, and he really epitomizes that in such a beautiful and uplifting way. And I've always found his shows really super uplifting, but actually I woke up this morning after having watched it last night and I felt better than I've done for months. So that's why I love it.
Yeah, I felt the same actually, because I felt a little bit with Ashish. It's one of those designers where, I think in a weird kind of way, it's quite rare that I'd say I would be happy to see something that you could have predicted almost last night. But I think we were really thankful and sort of really comforted for somebody to talk about, it's obviously topically, it's super relevant to talk about diversity and inclusivity. But more than that, because I think, previous seasons we would have literally been talking about the colour of the models on the catwalk and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Whereas now we're in this complete place of the sort of need for defiance, the need for totally rethinking the system. And with his last show, he was talking about how it was a show that was a kind of ode to the heartbreak that he'd felt about Brexit. And we've never really had to address that before. I think it's only in the last year that actually we've been confronted with some really, really tricky issues. And before it's all been things where we've kind of paid lip service. Yeah, it's been quite abstract and we've been able to talk about it in quite an intellectual way. Whereas now we're dealing with things where, I think most people in the creative industry, is probably fair to say, feel really, like there's a lot of things that we hold dear that are in jeopardy. So I wanted to see how he reacted to that and how the audience reacted, and
That's interesting. You just interviewed him recently for Tank.
Yes, I interviewed him for the current issue of Tank. And it was after the last show, the Spring Summer show, when he came out with his immigrant t-shirt on. And immediately you just thought, what is going on? What's Ashish saying? What's he talking about? So I was really interested to just go and have a chat with him. And it was just really fascinating, his whole, he's always been, as you say, he's always been really connected with what's going on. But I think that season he just felt really angry and, felt like he wanted to reclaim the word immigrant. And he got this really amazing outpouring of support and people telling him their stories after that show. And I think it's really interesting how, the power of a t-shirt. I know sometimes these things can be a bit kind of twee and half-baked, but that really did seem to speak to people. And I was really keen to see what he did this time, and it was a real progression of that. And I think he channeled the anger into a more positive space.
Well, it's interesting because that t-shirt almost kind of, his outfit almost became one of the looks of the collection, didn't it? Which we have seen before, like John Galliano using his outfits when he did his bows at Dior in a very special way. Same with McQueen with, We Love You Kate t-shirt and what have you. But I think there was something about this that just captured everyone's imagination. And I do think I'd be interested to sort of get your opinions on this. I think it's a really difficult time for designers to know what message to give out, particularly UK designers and actually American designers as well, because there is this element of wanting to respond to the events, surrounding you, but then how can you do that in a way that doesn't feel sort of awkward or uncomfortable, given that you are selling very, very expensive things?
You mean kind of just jumping on a bandwagon
well,
by...
I think it's very hard to give a message of sort of, you know, tolerance and inclusivity when the whole of fashion is built on this idea of, you know, exclusivity basically. And I've been interested actually that at the menswear shows, I felt like there was a real climate of anger, and you saw quite a lot of shows where they were almost quite dystopian, and whereas at the women's shows, a lot of the, especially the younger designers, have really erred on the side of sort of positivity and, you know, safe spaces and happiness. And, you know, Molly Goddard very much did that. A lot of them have done that, and I'm just interested. I think it's a really tricky time to know what balance to strike in terms of sort of responding to issues without looking, as you say, like you are jumping on a bandwagon. And I think, you know,
I think you can see though when it comes from a real place within the designer. I mean, Ashish's show was really moving. But also, Phoebe English had a similar. Her show was a response to the Women's March. She had different characters. You know, she had voice, hope, apathy, and she kind of created these characters around her response to that march. And you could see it's just an emotional gut reaction of the designers.
Yeah,
and that's when it works.
Even someone like you know, Raf Simons in a much more subtle way, but of course his work is much more subtle and it's much more about playing with codes anyway. I think if you look at, you know, I think it would have been weird if you'd see someone like Raf Simons at Calvin Klein all of a sudden going with something really gender bending, for instance, but the fact that it was more about kind of suits that anybody could wear, that you had the women and the men wearing very, very similar cuts of suits, that even that to a certain extent I think was that vibe kind of slowly slipping through. I mean, it's very difficult because obviously the timings for him anyway, when he'd probably started working on that collection, wouldn't have sort of permeated through in the same way. But I thought, you know, obviously, but I felt like even though he was kind of playing with the kind of codes of Americana, which obviously Ashish is doing in his collection as well, there was that sense, at least some kind of nod to this idea of equality.
It's almost like you can't ignore it.
Yeah, I think that idea of kind of equality is really important. And as you say, different people will manifest it in very different ways. Not everyone's going to do a slogan T-shirt because not everyone's going to go down the kind of Catherine Hamnett
New York got very
line.
slogan T-shirty. There were a lot of, you know, feminist T-shirts going on, and I think it. I think it's. I kind of, in my head, go between being very optimistic about it all and think it's brilliant, you know, that people are engaging, however they engage, through back to being very cynical and thinking, you know,
because they're like really expensive T-shirts.
Well, they're really expensive T-shirts, or it's just meaningless. You know, actually, like it does. You know, it's just. It's almost just for the fashion press to be able to sort of nod and feel better about them. Do you know what I mean?
But I think that actually it feels more positive this season that people are talking about the things that they are good at. And I think each designer seems more distinctive somehow. Maybe it's just my take on it. But when you see things that done in, as you say, their own personal way, like Marc Jacobs. You know, I thought that was really clever for him to do that, And it's a message, it's a slightly different kind of message, but it's a strong message. So I think there's, whether it's Calvin Klein's message, whether it's somebody as beautiful as Simone Rocha, just celebrating the beauty of making things for beautiful pieces to wear. I think there's a more of a sort of uplifting feeling about this season. Maybe not so much New York, but certainly in London. And this notion of creativity being a really powerful force. You see these fashionista guys, and you match both, and you think that's really fab and kind of gutsy, and it's about having an art school education and making things and being lots of things as well, not just being a designer, being a kind of cultural communicator.
Yeah, because you know, it's interesting because we're doing a big piece of work at Stylus at the moment about redefining the luxury landscape, and one of the things that we're looking at very heavily is the idea of a kind of intellectual affluence, and this idea of actually what your value systems are, and you know, luxury will always be about exclusivity in some ways, but actually is it more about you know, what you do creatively and imaginatively, and how you align with people on that basis and kind of showing your intellectual worth rather than literally just the kind of you know, what you can afford, and obviously this is very kind of, with Trump being the ultimate kind of loud luxury, shall we say, it's interesting to kind of talking about those sorts of ideas, I think, with this too.
Yeah, that is interesting actually. I do think there is an element of like, that comes into a lot of the young designers' works where they want, it's more and more this idea of clothes for like-minded people, so it's almost, and that in itself has this undertone of a sort of vaguely political message, because it is this idea that something that they subscribe to, if you buy their clothes, you are then subscribing to it, or even like supporting it. And I think that's quite interesting. Like, I think someone like Claire Barrow is quite a good example of that, you know, where it's like if you buy her clothes, you're interested in the issues that she's interested in, and it is a different form of, you know, it's not like a luxury, but it is in a way, because it's the luxury of, you know, values.
I think Claire Barrow is a really good one to pinpoint, actually, because I think, you know, she's just done a thing with you know, Melissa, the Brazilian footwear brand that's got a kind of big gallery space. And it's interesting because I think for young designers, there's that sense of actually she is still a fashion designer, but she's also an artist, and she's kind of willing to step off the treadmill a little bit. And I think particularly, you know, a couple of seasons ago, there's that sense of, you know, revolving doors at the big fashion houses, and I think Roger Treadray from St Martin's was talking about this idea of designers being treated like football managers. And it's almost like in and out, and kind of make the money, and if you're not making the big bucks, then you're out again.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And I think there's something quite interesting in that idea of actually that to be a really good designer, maybe you need to take sessions of your career out to refuel yourself, to kind of really work out who you are. Intellectually as well.
It is interesting that in the context of London, because I often think that, like, you have the men's shows, and even something like Casely Hayford, you think, you know, that's father-son now, but for a long time, like, Joe Casely Hayford was doing it on his own, and, you know, then drops off, then comes back, and then even, like, looking at Simone Rocha, you know, everyone, that was such a beautiful show, you know, so lovely, and, you know, she's such an amazing designer, and the consistency of her work is incredible, but, you know, I saw her mother, Odette, just before the show, and I was thinking of John Rocha, and you think, actually, you have these ebbs and flows within fashion of something that, you know, designers should be able to come back and forth and, you know, be on the schedule and then drop off the schedule and do a different project. And I think that is interesting. And, you know, I was thinking about this in the context of Ashish, actually, because he's been around for ages, a really long time. It's like 2005, I think, that he started his label. And I think that's maybe something that we as the press need to maybe be aware of more, and I do notice this a lot in the reportage around the shows. It's like people are obsessed with the new young thing, and actually we don't let people sort of reinvent themselves that much. You know, go away and do a project and then come back.
But I think the thing with Ashish is he's not doing anything different than he was doing in 2005.
But in a good way.
Yeah, in a good way. I mean, his message changes each season, and he does always have a message. And now we're just really ready to consume that message, and people actually want to buy into that. Somebody I was with yesterday at the show said afterwards, I really want to buy that now, I want to support him, I want to buy into that, and that's a real move now to, you know, we don't really want clothes as a status symbol anymore. We want clothes that actually, you know, say what our belief systems are, actually say something about us as people, and I really, really embrace that. I think that's brilliant that we're moving away from that. That is what fashion for me is about. It's not about I've got an expensive handbag.
I think the joyous thing that you were talking about before was really important as well. I think you know, that it's interesting, and it's brilliant because he works with Anna Trevelyan. I'm a big fan of Anna, and I think you have this kind of completely unfettered sort of bravery with doing things that are almost kind of borderline good taste, bad taste. Who cares? So. It's like stuff you could really kind of party in, basically. And there's that sense, you know, we were talking about with the Women's March, there was a real sense of, you know, I've been to kind of other things. I mean, when I was a teenager, and I used to go on like countless Greenpeace marches, and actually I was quite like, you know, moments of being like an aggressive teenager. That's like shouting at butchers. I'm not even a vegetarian any longer, but like you know, shouting meat is murder at butchers and things like that. And it was really interesting going to the march. We were talking about it earlier, how there was this incredible sense of kind of very comforting solidarity, and I think someone putting something out there like Ashish has done so boldly, it's so excessive, and it's almost like the more excessive the better, the more rainbow it is the better, that it's just this kind of complete and utter fabulous and inclusivity on every single level. It's like maximalist, you know, to the nth degree.
Well, because it's this fine line, isn't it, where it's not quite escapism, because escapism sounds like it's somehow sort of facile or unengaged. It's not this idea of like, oh, you know, forget your troubles and dance around. There is this kind of, there's this edge to it and this awareness to it, but within that so much joy, and I think that's what I find really interesting, because a lot of the big brands have really gone for this kind of escapist thing, you know, like, you know, fashion is fantasy, which is, I guess, what else can you do, you know, when you're a huge brand, it's very hard, as I said, to do something that feels sort of, you know, authentic.
But I think people have felt they've been in such a negative space over the past few months, and there has been a lot of hate and negativity on social media, on people really just having a go and venting. And I think there's a real feeling actually that he really tapped into cleverly of people actually thinking, no, let's just have some positivity, and actually, that hopefully will have a positive result.
Yeah. And I think there's a sense also that we kind of are maybe taking on almost a burden of what's going on, and actually people who are, obviously I say it with students, and I've got kids myself that are teenagers, and actually they're both really feeling strong about things, but also in a really positive and joyful way. They're out there, they're doing their own thing, they're totally not down with what's going on in the world, but they're doing something positive about it. They're not kind of almost taking on, and also thinking about things to do with sustainability, they're not kind of taking on the issues to do with climate change. They're kind of saying, we want to kind of create a great way of doing things, we want to make things ourselves, we want to work together. It's almost like, when I was a teenager myself, that whole kind of vibe about people being artists and musicians and designers and putting on clubs and having parties and doing collections, and it kind of feels as if maybe we're going to get to that sense again of a new kind of era.
There's a sense of people actually being, the one thing they are grateful with this whole situation is being sort of shaken out of their apathy. There's something really good about it. It's almost like there's a reawakening of sorts, and actually people feeling maybe for the first time actually there's a sense of purpose, there's a sense of kind of being alive, there is a sense of joyfulness, a sort of celebration of wanting to connect with people. Because, we talk about social media being really connective, etc., and it is in some ways, but a lot of social media engagement is actually a kind of exchange that isn't a particularly altruistic exchange. I think for the first time here, you're seeing, people talking about bigger things. But the only tricky thing I think, obviously, we probably really shouldn't ignore is that fashion shows are preaching to the converted.
Well,
somewhat.
that's what
like I say, I think it's still, obviously it's still very important, and it's still good. And actually, I think a show like this, because it's, as I said, it's so excessive, that I think that will help it to transcend. And also, because it's quite streetwear based as well, I think there's something really relatable about Ashish. As you're saying with some of the other things where it's a kind of slogan t-shirt in a way, whether it, whoever it is, whether it's Dior or whoever, it's great, but it's still kind of, but wear it underneath all your other very expensive, like your expensive suit jacket, etc. Whereas there's something here where it's a bit like, it's carnival, it's like Notting Hill Carnival. It's like when you're, you've lived in London for a while, all the best parts of London that are real melting pots of cultures. So I think there is a sort of accessibility, and you'll see this kind of trickle down into a lot of high street brands, and there's something brilliant about that.
Also, people looking at this like last night on Instagram, you just see it, and you do think it just actually transcends. It's the fashion thing, but it's also a cultural thing, and there's people of different kind of types of people, different ages, all responding to it, and it's like he's got a really sweet spot.
Fashion does have an incredible. It is this difficult thing, because I often get really cynical when you see people sort of getting big pats on the back, and you're like, and you feel like they're just speaking. It's like an echo chamber. They're speaking to people who already agree, and then everyone's praising them. It's just going round and round and round. But I do think, sometimes I try and break myself out of that, and I think actually, maybe when we work in it, we forget, because it's a luxury to work in fashion. But fashion does have a huge voice and a huge influence and a huge reach, particularly because of things like social media, and particularly on young people, which in a way can exacerbate the problem where you already feel like you're preaching to the converted, because young people do tend to be more liberal. Like, even if you look at statistics in terms of Brexit or young people that voted for Trump, it's much, much smaller numbers. So you feel like, okay, these people are going to grow up and the world's going to change, which is a great feeling. But then there's also that added element of fashion is speaking to those young people, which is brilliant to help encourage them in those beliefs, because you don't want them to grow up and become cynical. If the vote had been sort of under 25s, Brexit wouldn't have happened. So that's what's interesting, I think, about fashion is its engagement with sort of youth culture and young people.
And maybe what's happened actually will be a means for this current generation to kind of switch things, because it's right in their faces that there's this huge divide between the different ways that people are thinking. So there's a sort of void in the middle as well. There's sort of no opposition at the moment. There's this kind of sense that things are going in a direction that's quite frightening, and yet there isn't, it's almost a space for a new kind of type of culture to come through. There isn't already this sort of nirvana of, oh, this is actually what we should be following. It's kind of, it's an empty space at the moment, and so it's starting to be filled by new ideas.
And I think also the important thing is voices who aren't sort of typically like a liberal elite. That's like a phrase that was like bandied about a lot over sort of, Trump and Brexit and what have you. But I think what's interesting with some of the collections that I've been most interested about this fashion week is people who've come from a really interesting background. It doesn't have to, just interesting background is a good way of putting it. So like someone like Ashish, the fact he grew up in Delhi or what have you. And even like I was reading, The Guardian did quite a good profile on Stormzy, the grime artist. And it was interesting to read that in the context of he's someone who's really, really influencing people and is in some way part of this like cultural hub of like, exciting London people doing interesting things. But he's not part of a typical, liberal elite in that way. And I'm interested to see how fashion can also allow for that to happen, because it is worrying, I think, the number of students who come from very wealthy backgrounds and go through the art schools and then come onto the schedule and you think, okay, this is a certain type of person. And what's great about people like Ashish, and hopefully, we'll see more designers like this, is they are offering a very unique perspective and the kind of perspective you do get in music, because it's, I feel like there's more opportunities to sort of get in.
I agree, Yeah, I think so. I read, I think it was Hadley Freeman actually. It was a really interesting article at the weekend where it was talking about the death of Tara Palmer Tompkinson, and kind of talking about how everyone kind of at the time, it was like everyone was so dismissive of her and kind of, oh my god, it's awful, she's got this kind of crazy party lifestyle, but it was very honest, it was very out in the open. She completely she sort of made fun of herself, she derided herself a lot, and actually looking at the kind of it girls that we have today, a lot of people, it's amazing when really we talk about people like Cara Delevingne being like the face and the voice of British youth, and you think, come on, really, she's got kind of Viscount, I mean, nothing against her personally, but I really think there's a bit of a problem if we think that someone that's got like baronets and viscounts in their family is the voice of youth culture.
Successful people. That is like literally every front row, every cool model at the moment is the daughter or son of
apart
a
from
successful
Boa,
person.
who is just fantastic, and her whole idea around girls talk.
But then even she is the daughter of a success. She's not like plucked from obscurity. I think she's.
But her attitude and her kind of stance and how she speaks to people, I think, is the epitome of the opposite way of thinking of actually kind of, and maybe it's a personal thing, because I see my daughter and her friends kind of like aspiring to actually be somebody that is quite political because of people like that who are working in fashion. There's something that they're really interested in, but at the same time they're talking about issues to do with mental health, issues that affect these kids on a day-to-day basis that they don't get to talk about. So I do think that it's really important that you've got people like that being able to kind of speak out.
But I think as well, just increasingly, we want to engage with designers that have something to say and have some kind of comment on something. And often those designers aren't the ones that grew up in the lap of luxury. They're designers that have had a more interesting, diverse background.
London College of Fashion actually had a gala, and Grayson Perry did a speech, and he said, I just don't think the next Alexander McQueen is going to come from Eton. And he was like, I just don't. And a lot of people, I put it on my social media after, a lot of people got really angry and were like, oh, that's like reverse snobism. But I do kind of, I think it's just having a different perspective, whether it's you didn't grow up in London, or you had a, I don't know what it is. There's just something, you see it in certain designers, which is like they just have this eye. It's like they've seen beyond what they're now existing within, and I think that's the trouble comes when people grow up within that and then continue to exist within that. It's
like the all the creativity that comes out of suburbia. Or it's kind of, because if you live in suburbia or you live in anywhere near suburbia, you have this weird kind of limbo land. And you're not in the kind of grassroots culture where you've got something to really rail against, but neither are you privileged. So you're almost in this kind of beige middle ground. And that's why I think you get a lot of really, David Bowie being the obvious big one. That do fabulous things as well. I mean, I think it's important, that kind of inverse snobbery about, you can only have an opinion if you're, sort of from what we would have called working class. Then you're allowed opinion. If you're very traditionally privileged, you can't. It's something that's a bit dangerous as well, because really we just all need to be getting out, as you say, and to have this kind of spectrum of opinions. I mean, it was funny actually, because I did a thing at Ravensbourne with a brilliant designer, Jenna. I just lost her second name now. But I'll think of it before the end of the panel, but she had done a thing with Dazed, and it was really funny because she was a little bit pissed off at the end, because they basically almost inferred that because she was from Blackpool, she had this sort of like really tough upbringing, and she was literally, it was sort of like northern class, hard as nails, like scrapping down the disco every Friday night. And I mean, partly because of her work was informed by tracksuits. You know, so that was probably
if
why.
you're wearing a tracksuit, you must be a fighter.
But it was funny because, you know, I think her dad was like a mechanic and her mum was a costume designer, or a costume design professor of costume design. So actually, but
it was the same when Agnes Dean, that model, like came to Paris, and it was like, you know, the story's got more and more in it. It's like she'd been like plucked from a chip shop. But literally they were
battering Mars bars
like,
off to school every day.
And then when I was working on the North exhibition, my co-curator Adam like pulled out some of the kind of old headlines and stuff, and we were like, oh my god. But that is the thing, I think, slightly, and I wonder why fashion sort of in part is fetishizing those aspects while also sort of pushing your children of successful, you know, I find that really strange. The whole Dolce & Gabbana show was all like these influencers, 90% of which were the children of famous people, and then you see it, you know, with your, again, nothing against them personally, I'm sure they're very interesting people, but like, or very nice people, but like, you know, your Lottie Mosses and those kind of things, or you think, what message is they're sending to a young person?
You know, but we allow this to happen. You know, I was reading about Brooklyn Beckham yesterday, and how, you know, he's going to be this amazing photographer, and, you know, it's got nothing to do with his parents. He's just really pleased that, you know, he's got these 9.3 million followers on Instagram. But, you know, they're there because they appreciate the quality of his work. I don't think so.
I read that too.
And, you know, but we allow this to happen. Burberry then books him to shoot a campaign. I mean, please.
That's lazy.
But I don't get why. I mean, it's somewhere along the line it must translate to sales.
Yeah, of course.
But
but do you know what? There's going to be
there
is going to be a backlash against that, because actually we're doing a bit of an analysis on this at the moment. We're working with this brilliant company, Circle, that are charting all this for us. And actually the sweet spot, if you really want, because to make actual kind of conversions, proper full-on sales, or have what you call brand engagement that really sticks to get proper traction, actually the sweet spot with influencers is people that have between about 10 and 15,000 followers.
Oh my god, yeah, I had Shah Roberts from Mush Pair and Nelly were in the other day, and they were talking about the micro-influencer. And I'd never heard of this.
It's like this niche influencer, because the people, realistically, the people that have about 1 million influencers, half the people that follow them actually don't even see it because they're following 1 million other people. They're not really engaging with it. They're not buying anything from it. So actually it's about, and because of this sort of rise in what we call intellectual affluence, there's that desire to connect with people that actually have a degree of authenticity, or are showing something you really haven't seen before. Because a lot of the brands are really, really fed up with paying people that they feel are kind of inexperienced. They feel like they're being pushed into doing it because they have to, because there's this number of eyeballs you'll have on those Instagram accounts. But at the same time, they're inexperienced people they're kind of allying with, or people that are inexperienced or don't have a voice. I'm not saying that goes for all bloggers. I'm just saying there's a good proportion of them, because of the way things are translated from most of those bloggers basically just being kind of paid for ad space now.
And that whole thing of being able to be experimental, I mean, I think it is tricky for the big guys now, because they can't be as experimental, because there's so much on show, there's so many people, there's so much at stake.
So quickly
and you can crash quite quickly, whereas if you're doing your thing and you can kind of go left and right, and as you said, you know, and some of the people you've been talking about, people like Claire Barrow, who's kind of made a decision not to show in the same way as you know, a much bigger designer couldn't make that decision. They don't have that luxury of being able to say, you know what, I'm going to do this slightly differently. Whereas those guys, and there's lots of them, and I suppose if we can have lots of the mini influencers, that is also when you start to kind of get a cultural movement.
Like John Skelton is doing the same. He's showing his show collection in March, I think, and just, you know, he's got his own timetable. But those people are actually really smart, because they have a single moment when everybody kind of looks at them and they're not all in the middle of Fashion Week madness.
And they also cut through, I think, a lot of the sort of, there is a lot of hype that comes with Fashion Week, and then and a lot of it doesn't translate to sales. Like, I have talked about this on panels before, but there's a good interview with Thomas Tate on SHOWstudio in the In Fashion series, and he talks about that point he got to where he had so much press but just didn't have the sort of sales or the buy to back it up in some ways. And he talked about like the disparity between that and people thinking he was this huge brand, this big business, you know, this super successful London designer, when actually he wasn't. And I think that's also something that's really smart to sort of go your own way, a bit like the John Skelton example, is you kind of remove yourself from that flurry of Fashion Week that can leave you sort of churned out after 4 seasons, where you're like, okay, I've got loads of press and now no one wants to write about me anymore because I'm not the new, you know, and I think that can be really dangerous.
And it takes a long time to hone your art and your skills. And you know, John Skelton's one of the students that I worked with, and you know, his pattern cutting skills, his tailoring, it's taken him a long time, and he's done it really carefully and really super well. And you can't do that overnight.
No.
And you need to have the chance to kind of nurture that, and if you suddenly rush and then have to get everything out there, it compromises that.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting that some of the young designers are erring on the side of like bespoke type businesses. I think that's really interesting, and I hope that because that is kind of
and almost having direct sales to their community, which I think is
just one of the only viable ways really to build a business, isn't it? You know,
I mean that gives you strength, and it gives you a little bit of your own autonomy, because it is built on the skills that you've got, and it isn't something that can be taken away from you.
And also it is truly sustainable. You know, you have your circle of buyers, and you know who they are almost, and you're not kind of, you know, getting trapped into this thing of making more and more stuff,
and you don't have stores telling you actually don't do that, do this,
and you have relationships with people, and relationships with your manufacturers, relationships with the factories, and with your customers, and those are the things that build over time and actually give you a sustainability from a perspective of your business, and also from a perspective of how you value resources, human and material. So I think it is really interesting, although I do think that some of the big buyers as well are really changing. I mean, we've been working with Selfridges. It's so interesting to see how they are really going out of their way to champion designers that are doing things from a sustainability perspective. They're really thinking about their buying practices, and you kind of need those two ends. You need the designers, but you also need the buyers.
Do you think that consumers are becoming more, do you think part of the reason stores are doing that is because consumers are becoming sort of more aware and more attuned and more vocal? Like, I was thinking about the whole grab your wallet thing, and I was like, actually, you know, consumers have a lot of power, and I think, you know, for a long time people, you know, all of that stuff of like, well, don't buy it, you know, people just would anyway, and I wonder if we've reached a bit of a turning point with that, where people are actually, you know, don't want to purchase. When everyone was deleting their Ubers and stuff, you know, and that had a real effect. Same with grab your wallet.
I don't know how long that lasted for, though.
Oh no, I did not. I really disliked myself that week. I kept getting Ubers, and I was like, no, it was really actually really bad. You know, when you're like, oh god, I'm an awful person. But the grab your wallet thing was really, the grab your wallet thing was really interesting. You know, that actually caused. It was really funny when Nordstrom made that comment where they were like, you know, this has nothing to do with the Grab Your Wallet campaign, it's because of poor performance. And I was like, that is what that's what the campaign was.
Nobody bought the
it's like no one bought it because of the anyway. But do you both think that, well, everyone, do you all think that consumers are getting more sort of?
I do. I hope so. I mean, I think it's not going to suddenly happen overnight, but I think that there's a mixture of a kind of political turning point, but also the fact that people are saturated by so much stuff, and actually a lot of it looking really samey, and the speed of stuff and the kind of freneticism and the noise or whatever, and just seeing, you know, piles of stuff. And I think that there's a saturation point.
We've hit peak stuff, definitely, and also, you know, there's a generation coming up that are kind of more willing to get involved in the sharing economy and actually rent things and buy things, and obviously with a lot of luxury things, that's pretty useful because it's not the cheap things you want to rent or share. So I think, that sense of it, and people just becoming more aware that things becoming irrelevant. Which again, in a way, also dovetails into that idea of wanting to kind of make a stand about kind of being less concerned with seasons. And then when you've got, you know, brands like Topshop all of a sudden selling things on a catwalk and having a catwalk stuff you can buy immediately, which is obvious because it's Topshop, but nevertheless, it means that everything's in flux. So actually, I think the kind of fallout, the kind of overall message from that is, that people are kind of starting to get back on their own track, to become more individual about, be a little bit less concerned about trends.
I think the sharing economy is really interesting that you say that, like things like from your vestiaires through to your Depops, and the fact that you know, that is something, it's all about, you know, the piece, or, you know, wanting that particular item, and it doesn't really matter whether someone's owned it before you, and I think that is really interesting.
I mean, my 14-year-old's obsessed with Depop.
Really?
That's where she buys all her clothes from, and I just think, hallelujah, that's just amazing.
And also it means that when they're buying things themselves, they're thinking, what's the value of this?
Yeah.
What's the resale value of this?
They don't care that it's pre-owned, and actually she doesn't even want to wash it. It's just like put it on,
and they wrap them up beautifully, and it becomes quite a personal thing. My daughter's the same. She has a particular signature when she sends things.
But can we just talk about the Oxfam show quickly, which was just, I don't know.
I didn't see it.
Okay, so Oxfam had a show that Bay Garnett styled.
And Cecilia Chancellor,
Stella Tennant. I mean, it was just absolutely brilliant, and it was wonderful seeing all of these charity second-hand clothes looking amazing. I mean, obviously Stella Tennant's going to make the suit look incredible, but that was another really positive moment actually over at the beginning of this week, when people realised that actually there are so many clothes out there, and you can just go into your Oxfam shop.
And it's been a long time coming, because Oxfam opened on Westbourne Grove and King's Road about 10 years ago with a completely different stance on the kind of value of things that have been brought into them. But it's taken this long actually for people to get to the point of thinking.
The sweet irony is all the best collections, the research department have gone to a charity shop or a thrift store and bought a vintage piece and then copied it. So it's like, it all starts from like your Oxfams anyway, it all cycles right back.
I mean, overall, I think it's just indicative of people not wanting to be pushed around, as you said, with the grab your wallet thing. I mean, we did a piece of work that was purely about dissent, about this currency of dissent last season. I say last season in kind of October. That idea that people are fed up with being told that it's Black Friday, it's Cyber Monday, it's this, these are all things that are manufactured seasons.
It's like when people go crazy, they decide they don't want the song to be Christmas #1.
Down with Simon Cowell.
You get these totally weird things where people are like, no, it shan't.
And then they realised that it was like Gareth Malone and his church choir, and then they were distressed about that as well. So it can backfire.
But I do think we need that in fashion where people are like, there shan't be #1. So that was a weird reference from me.
But even like like streetwear, we looked at some really funny stuff with like the communications, talking about how brands that weren't communicating that kind of, hey, it's hot pants season, and kind of content that's really just 6 different ways to wear your hot pants sort of thing. And so brands, like these streetwear brands, that half the beauty is that their communications were actually like outrageously rude. Where people would go on Twitter, hello customer service, I've got a hole in my jumper, and they just go, put your arms through it, mate. I just get paid to get mashed and do the Twitter. I don't care. And actually, even that was interesting, because it showed there was that sort of an appetite for a different mode of communication, a different relationship with brands, a different kind of.
But there was also, I love the fact that now the consumer has a direct way into the brands, and with something like Fashion Revolution, where they've been asking people to tweet who made my clothes to the different brands. It's so empowering that every individual has that ability to do that, and actually brands really jump to it the minute you put anything on Twitter.
It's empowering both ways actually, because within the brands it's people like all of us who are wanting to do good stuff and don't necessarily get the chance to communicate it directly. And there's far more direct communication now between people in design teams and the customers, and
so they can't really hide so much, I think.
And that is reflected, I think, in high fashion. I think that's part of the reason that like teams have come to the forefront. For a long time it felt like it was kind of the era of the lone star designer, this genius working out of his studio and making all the stuff. And now you have things like the collectives, like the Vetements thing, and a lot of duos like your Marcus Almeida and Rodarte, or people like that who are working together. I think you're seeing that with a lot of the young designers, so like Etude, there's 3 of them, Aggie and Sam, all of that. But I also think, whenever you see an interview now with a designer, they always talk about their team, always, and the people that work with them, they often have I was thinking of Jonathan Anderson and having Benjamin Bruno, and also having Jamie Hawksworth, and also having Stephen Meisel and MM Paris, and it's this idea of a community around you, which I think has partly also come from what you were saying. It's this idea of who's behind everything, and getting rid of that smoke and mirrors of you know, like there's
it being one person.
Yeah,
at the end of the show, that this is the reason it's here. And it's never been. That's never been the case.
No, exactly. So, as it ever was, it's just more talked about.
There is something really appealing about that idea of the kind of hive mind. I think it's really appealing because I think in a lot of ways everybody who wouldn't want to be part of that, like who wouldn't be a fantasy for, basically. The idea that, you know, you could be great what you do on your own, but you could come together with a kind of commune of like-minded people. I mean, whether it's Vetements or whether it's, you know, Marina Abramovich and her initial, I mean, obviously she's solo now, but at one point she was part of a group of performance artists.
And she's never solo because her work
she's never really solo. Exactly. But that idea of being part of a kind of fed by this sort of brilliant creative hive mind is a really appealing, it's kind of like a mythical thing.
But it's like, you see it in music, I think, massively, you know, everyone's sampling each other and getting everyone on stage. And
although I do think there needs to be some kind of figurehead, because you know, there was that whole discussion about with Chanel whether when Karl Lagerfeld, if he hasn't already become like a hologram that they're just wheeling out occasionally, that they would replace it by kind of a rotating group of, you know, collective of people. And there are those instances where you think, but in which case all brands will begin to kind of meld into one. You know, there'll be a collective here and a collective here, and everyone's a collective, and actually where's any kind of differentiation?
And I think because the word, you know, collaboration, especially when you're thinking about this sort of sustainability, people talk about it a lot, but it's a really tricky thing, and there isn't just one way, and it isn't just everybody all cooperating together and agreeing with each other. It takes a lot of strong-minded separate people who know what their own strengths are and recognise each other's, and it's going to work in some ways.
That's the kind of mythical thing, actually. And I think some of those, I mean, I'm sure you've encountered a lot of this with your book. Some of the best things come when you hear about these kind of raging arguments. I mean, I remember even when I interviewed, this was ages ago, but Patty Wilson, yeah, that's what I mean. And talking about her relationship with David LaChapelle, and just saying how it was literally like pulling teeth, and they would jar up against each other but did amazing things, incredible things, and they sort of love-hate marriages. And when you get that in a group as well, I mean, that's part of the legend, I guess.
If you've got a sort of shared sense of where you want to get to and the things you care about, then, you know, you do need to have different ways of getting there. But and you know, different designers work in different ways, and I think it has to have a real honesty. I mean,
for sure,
you know,
and a point of view as well. A really strong point of view.
It's exciting because I think it's that idea of you know, the author Malcolm Gladwell talks about disagreeable differences. Says that in a lot of businesses, a really big problem is that businesses will try to go for social cohesion. So people even will employ people quite like them, and subliminally a lot of the time. But what you end up getting is you know, an office or a studio full of people that are almost too like-minded. That actually there's nothing to butt up against, there's nothing to push you forward, nothing to kind of pull you out of yourself. And I think that's really interesting in the current political context about this idea that somehow creatively we have to get to a place where what we're doing educates people, and I don't mean in a traditional sense, but kind of takes these messages and takes them out of fashion and into those people that aren't in our own echo chamber. Because you know, it's amazing the conversations we have in the office where people are just shocked, where we'll talk about things and I'll go, but guys, you have to remember we're in the minority. In terms of Brexit, we were in the minority. All the people, pretty much everybody in my office.
But that's that scary thing about even like it comes down to sort of social media and the way that everything is programmed to just show you things, people that think like you. And it's interesting to talk about disagreement, because that's one of the things that's come out when so this book I'm doing on collaboration on duos. A phrase that has come up a lot, which I find really charming and interesting, is people have said we disagree but we don't argue, and I found that really interesting. Is this idea of them challenging each other a lot without having these huge fights. You know, like I think someone, I can't remember who it was, which was really, really bad, but someone, they said we disagree constantly but we don't argue. And I thought that was really interesting.
It's so important, because you don't really understand yourself until you kind of confront yourself, or somebody confronts you. You know, if you're all sitting there kind of agreeing, it's kind of like, well, what are we agreeing about?
You kind of have to have minor conflict to grow, as hard as that is. And most people in most things we do in life will veer away to do with things that are different or aren't comfortable or we aren't good at. For instance, it's that sort of the self-fulfilling prophecy thing, that actually you'll just constantly lean towards the same things and you'll go off on this tangent. So again, I think that's part of the brilliant kind of the legend, and that's why actually these stories, I mean, I'm really excited to see your book, because those stories are really good to get out there, that life can be difficult. And I think part of, you know, what we're talking about with Ashish is that idea of, you know, celebrating the difference. Should we have a look? I'm conscious of time. We could go on for so long. We've really gone on. Sorry, Britt. Can we have a look at the show? I really love the masks.
The
wrestler mask. I think what I like about that is because a lot of Ashish's work, I think, because it does have that kind of, at some points, a couple of years ago, it might have been considered by some people a bit kind of too sweet, a bit kind of too rainbow, a bit kind of too Harajuku kid. But I like the fact that masks give that sense of rebellion and defiance. It's a very obvious symbol.
Really dark.
I like the fact that it's an obvious symbol of sort of darkness and
but also obviously
wrestling,
the whole
literally.
Mexican thing,
Yeah.
it was so clever to bring that
but also like a baseball, because the collection is all Major League Baseball collaboration.
And I think that's just amazing. So he's got this collaboration actually officially with the Major League Baseball, which is such a smart thing to do and such a actually very subversive thing to do.
But it goes back to what we were saying as well about like reach and the audience that you're going to go to, because actually, this is like sport and fashion, not really. You see this sport kind of like Nike with or Adidas with, but I do feel like that's a huge like popular area of people that someone like Ashish would never have reached.
No.
And also it's that understanding, that really sort of subtle message around, it's not that certain things are bad and certain things are good, because there's a lot of, the whole idea of basketball, the Americana thing, that people might, as an immediate reaction, think, oh, that's the sort of thing that is very much of a nationalistic thing. Actually, it's about a diversity element, and also you can't start to judge one game or one element of society. So I think it's really clever how he's been so non-judgmental at the same time as being really strong with his messaging, and bringing in the subtleties of the Mexican masks, the notion of the broken heart that everybody walked through. So reminding us, 1 minute it was Brexit that was the reason my heart was broken, now it's kind of these other reasons that all come together, but actually I'm responding to it in a way that is joyful, because I know that most people actually, and there's one or two things about the notion of we are actually great people and we actually do want to do good things for each other and don't give up the daydream and things like that.
I like
most people actually are loving, and most people actually do care about each other. We sort of mustn't forget that, is what he's saying.
With number 8, I like the fact that you are much lovelier than you think. At some points I probably would have thought, oh my god, there's like a billion messages about literally throwing the kitchen sink at this, but actually I quite like the fact that in every possible way this is like a vomiting of sort of positive sentiment, and why not? So on this occasion I feel really good about it.
But I thought it was done with such a lightness of touch. It wasn't ramming any of these messages down your throat, and more glitter, less Twitter. I mean, it's just genius.
Wonderful.
Wonderful. It's funny. And
his Instagram's really funny. He's a really funny. I've never met him, but it's pretty funny. Yeah.
Ashish's Instagram. I mean, he has obviously got a great sense of humour.
But so different to Christopher Shannon did slogans, and I also love Christopher Shannon. I find him hilarious. I think he's so smart. But his was, I was saying that the menswear was slightly more sort of cynical and pissed off, and he did all these slogans, which was like plays on different logos about being sort of exhausted and tired, and like I can't remember what some of them were directly. There was like can we get up the Christopher Shannon men's collection, because you can have a look. And I think it's really interesting to see the difference between something like that and something like this, which is just a few weeks difference in terms of when they started working on these collections, but super interesting in terms of just the different way of expressing your response to the world around you. Like it's
but I love that it is a response to the world around us. That I think is fundamentally what is making the most successful collections this season, is a really honest response.
It's very heartfelt. She feels really heartfelt.
He said yesterday, I talked to him after the show, and he said, I said to him, did you cry doing this collection? He said, I had a little cry this morning. And it was, I mean, truly heartfelt.
What did they say? I haven't got my glasses on.
But that notion of that, that's what fashion should be anyway.
And the fact that constant stress, which is quite funny. The difference in that kind of to go from constant stress to like
I'm done. Says me.
But I suppose that we all kind of have been through that, that initial kind of feeling, you know, after the Brexit vote, after the Trump vote, and then certain absolute moments where you're just in shock, and it's just like you're the wind is taken from you, and then now you kind of like
good about the Women's March. The thing I really wasn't expecting with the Women's March is that they had just some of the best banners I've ever seen, just hilarious stuff.
Oh my god, some of them were so funny. Also, the Scottish ones were the best. Oh my god, I laughed so hard. Like there were, I'm sure like BuzzFeed or someone has done like a collection of like the best Scottish. They were so funny. I've never laughed that hard. They were amazing.
There was like, you know, there was stuff like, you know, the Melania, blink if you're in there.
Yes.
Brilliant. And, you know, dumb blonde, there's a picture of him. And just, you know, I was kind of expecting that it would just literally just be like, you know, down with Donald Trump. But actually it was just like wit and intelligence and humour and really sort of graciously done in it in a way.
And the whole pussy hats thing as well is just such a strong fashion. I mean, that notion of fashion reacting to what's going on, that is actually what the best of fashion always has been, and something that, you know, is so kind of simple but actually so powerful, and the notion of people making them themselves, and the whole kind of craziness of they're all made in the place, and the hats, the made in America hats were made in China. It's kind of like that's just absolutely what fashion is about. It's about something that's real, it's about a response, and it's about things, you know, a statement
that you could do it yourself. You know, suddenly there are all these videos on YouTube of how to knit your own pussy hat. I mean, how brilliant. Can we just number 11, Love Sees No Colour. I don't know why, but I did at that point was really, that was the point. I thought, oh, and you could feel this kind of tangible sense around you that people were kind of welling up. And it's me. And I mean, it's, you know, it's a kind of twee statement in a way. But it was really strong and heartfelt. And, you know, I mean, I talked to him actually when I interviewed him about the lack of diversity in the fashion industry. And he was just, he's genuinely kind of flabbergasted as to why it is. And, you know, he was saying, you know, you sit on the train and you see around you, you know, it's not just black and white, it's every colour in between. And fashion just is not representative of that. And I mean, even looking at this panel, I mean, look at us. And you know, and sometimes, I don't know, it's laziness. I don't know. There are other voices and other perspectives out there, and we don't listen to them enough.
No, definitely. You see it. You see it when you look around fashion shows, though. It's just like it's like we're all there, and then everyone kind of criticises if the models are all white. But then it's like, look at us, we're all white. You know, it's super weird.
It's self-perpetuating.
Totally. I can't work out what it is. I
suppose we all kind of link with people like us.
But
is that a really dreadful thing to say? And we need to kind of break out of that cycle.
I think you're right.
And I mean, Ashish is absolutely, you know, well and truly broken out.
I genuinely don't know. Like I remember one of the shows that I found most difficult to stomach was one of the Saint Laurent shows, Eddie Slimane shows, and it was like, well, I'm talking about LA, and it's just like, but within a given mile, like huge Hispanic culture, you've got huge, and it was really that sort of sense of isolationism that you felt with that show just totally amazed me.
I think maybe that is also a problem with sort of the more successful designers or editors or whatever become, the more privileged lives they lead, and the more they're just around people who tell them what they want to hear when they don't see it. You know, the more successful a designer you become, you're on flights, you're traveling from the studio in cars to your house to your, you know, the head office. You're not actually like, you know, getting out and about. You're not doing any of that stuff. And I think you become like, I actually always found that quite interesting with Riccardo Tisci, how he'd always talk about like getting to a point where he would just go back and go to sort of, you know, like a really shitty bar or like, you know, go out with his friends. And I think, you know, I think there has to be an element where you keep that side of you, otherwise you just stop seeing stuff and like nothing's real.
You become John Galliano.
Exactly. You just become sort of in this world.
Well, it's a little bit like music albums, isn't it? When people do like a really great album because it really comes from the heart, and you've got their struggles and you've got their real life, and they're telling a very original story. And then all of a sudden they get this life of luxury, and actually their life of luxury is quite similar to other people who have the same kind of whopping income.
So your perspective goes.
And I think you're right, Tamsin, that we think that we've come a long way, which we obviously have in the last generation or two, but actually there's still, even before everything that's happened in the last 12 months, there was so much more to do, and maybe we were getting a bit complacent and actually not thinking about what else, you know, we'd almost kind of slowed down.
Complacent's an interesting word, because the big thing in fashion is like, fashion is the industry of like unsaid truths, you know. Like, it is bizarre that you like walk out of shows and you'll be with people and they'll be like, God, that was awful, wasn't it? And they'll be like, the advertiser, and then they would like, they'll write something nice about it, whatever, and it's like, there's so much in fashion that people just don't talk about. And I think it's interesting what you say there, because it is this idea now that like you can't be complacent anymore, but I also think you have to be a bit more honest now. I think to maintain those kind of like, oh, we all know he's awful, but you know, no one's going to say it, or we all know the collection was bad, but no one's going to talk about it, or yeah, the casting's really, you know, racist, but no one's going to say it. I think that's just, it doesn't work anymore. I think because people are seeing through that, you know. And I think a really good example of that was actually when the Balenciaga show, where everyone was tweeting about the casting and saying, you know, critics are calling a show that was all white models revolutionary, blah, 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 and really going for it. And you, again, it goes back to that power of, sort of social media and people calling people out and saying, you know, I'm not.
Which is great, because it's been opened up to beyond the little fashion bubble. That's why, you know, suddenly everybody has access to this world and has a say in how it should be. And,
but you saw it when, because Vogue did their, American Vogue just did their diversity issue, and they did...
but an issue?
You know,
it says it all.
And that's something that's been happening for 10 years, you know, 10 years ago, Italian Vogue.
But then they did Carly Kloss's, like, in a geisha sort of shoot, and like, I kind of feel bad for Carly, because she's got a load of flack, and Carly's actually, I think, a really quite an amazing woman who does a lot to support other women, so it kind of made me feel bad for her. And it's whoever commissioned it, it's just madness. But then I was like, you've done like a white woman dressed as an, like, what the hell? Like, you know, were there no models available apart from a white model? It's just super weird. But they got called out, really, really called out. And you thought, you know, like 10 years ago, that issue would have come out and people may have grumbled in their living rooms when they read it, but there would have been no way to voice that.
But it is kind of shocking that somebody thought that was okay.
Oh yeah, but there's so much of that, you know, when you're like, really?
Like, somebody obviously saw it was like diversity, it's a buzzword. There'll probably be an inclusivity issue as well, I imagine.
But I think there is...
But I don't think a lot of those, but I think a lot of magazines, I mean, I used to work for Harper's Bazaar, and so I feel like I can fairly say, I don't think they're where the great information is coming from. There's a line to be towed with those magazines. I'm not saying that the people that work on them aren't great and very talented, but realistically, and because of predominantly actually because of the advertiser thing you were talking about, it's just a sort of self-perpetuating series of kind of, this is who we'll write about, this is who we'll photograph, we'll only photograph people if they're a certain level of attractiveness. That completely goes on. So even the kind of features that you would look at, we're going to, you know, talk about an artist in their home. Is she beautiful? She's a beautiful artist. It's like, what kind of creative culture do we live in if someone can only be really championed or be a creative hero if they're also very photogenic? I mean, obviously that's more symptomatic of being in the social media generation as well.
But you know, it'll be like the 5 young artists you need to know, and then they'll all be stunning, and you're like, that's weird.
But then if we're saying that these other things are going on, and these smaller kind of designers doing different things at their own pace and in different ways going on, I suppose what we've got to work out is how we can make sure that we're part of shining a light on those things and not shining a light on the stuff that is so loud.
A Ashish panel, not like a versus panel, or, you know, I think it's also, I think it is supporting, it's like talking about them and then buying them. I think that's, you know, the people who do have the money to do that, it is putting your money where your mouth is and going, actually, I'm not going to buy, you know, Celine, and even though it's beautiful and I love it, I'm going to buy something from Ashish. I think that's really important, of trying to sort of support young designers and put your money where your mouth is.
Because in the end, what you're wearing represents who you are, and people, I think, are getting more and more, clear about the fact that they don't want to be represented by something that they don't agree with, and the more they know about it, the less likely they are to buy into it.
It is this weird thing, just taking it in a slightly different time. I have been surprised by how many designers have done like Americana themed collections. So because like Raf did it with Calvin Klein and with his own collection. Riccardo Tisci did sort of Americana, Mimi Wade, which she always does Americana. This is like America. It's
well, I
weird
think,
time.
but I think people genuinely want America to be great.
And
deeply.
It's like make America great again.
Yeah,
again.
It's
really great.
I think people are traumatized by what is happening.
It's a sense of solidarity.
And their vision of America they want to bring back.
Nobody wants to see kind of America crumble into this kind of just detritus of.
And actually, this whole thing that he used the Major League Baseball, and he talked about how, it was the first sport to allow a person of colour to play professionally. And it's that thing that America is, the land of the free and
of immigrants.
The land of immigrants. Yeah. And, and that's all being taken away from everybody.
Well, did you see that New Yorker cover? It was about 3 weeks ago. They did the Statue of Liberty and the torch was extinguished. And oh my God.
God,
Talk about you welling up at this. I was scrolling through Instagram and I saw it and I was like,
the New Yorker is really going for it though, isn't it?
Yeah, really going for it.
They will not let this.
No, they won't let it go.
Lie.
But then it's like the Statue of Liberty, like it's inscribed on it, like give me your like tired masses, and then it's like, oh okay. But it's interesting actually that like to look at. God, I really need to wear my glasses. This is really bad. 27, where it says never give up. It is that idea, as you said, of like. 27, sorry.
28's fab too.
28's good as well. But,
but
it is that idea you said of kind of...
there's hope.
Yeah,
there is hope. And that was going back to Phoebe English's show as well, where she had, she actually had at the end, there was the girl, kind of just with a huge, amazing sort of laurel wreath around her, and she was hope. Yeah. And it's like, we're not going to give up hope.
And it isn't that everything has all suddenly kind of fallen apart. Actually, it's up to us. There's things that are of kind of big hurdles, but actually all the elements of culture that we have been a part of. And I think that Americana thing is because we've all of us lived with American culture all our lives. And so we want to look at it, we want to question it, we want to find the parts in it that actually do have a real sense of something that is positive. It's not that every element and baseball actually I think is really a good one as a starting point for conversation, because it might on the surface seem to epitomise that whole notion of the sort of sense of a great America and
something I didn't know about baseball as well is I know at some stage I won't say who it was, but it's a very, very famous illustrator that was asked to he was working with a brand like a Heineken or something like that, and they were going to do something on a big baseball bat, like drawn as baseball bat, and this particular illustrator loves baseball, but actually the brand wouldn't let him do it at the time because they said baseball actually, compared to American football, baseball was the kind of real working class, the grassroots thing, which I think most of us probably wouldn't really consider in Britain. And so there's that idea of baseball also being the kind of everyman's game.
It's very universal.
Exactly. A big kind of unifier, a sort of level playing
field. I think sport is though. It's like sport is always so divisive, like teams and what have you. But then it's this weird thing of like, it's quite a good message for the now, because it's like you can so stridently believe in something and so like wholly disagree with someone, but you're doing things together. So it's almost like you're engaging with something together, even though you completely have a different.
This discourse,
which is what I think is the problem at the moment, is people have these completely different beliefs and then are kind of ghettoized within them. So there are like people living in cities being super liberal, going on Facebook, and because of that algorithms only seeing people that agree with them, and then there's people living outside of cities or in different places believing something totally different
and feel very disenfranchised,
and everyone's apart and they're not enjoying the same things, whereas sport is like this idea that you can completely like hate each other's kind of principles as in their team, but you're still together.
I think it's like the thing that Theresa May keeps saying, she wants to unify the country, and you just think how, but actually
with Ashish
we all need to go to a baseball game together and it would all be fine with our t-shirts.
Get on the phone to Theresa now. It's just sequins.
I do think it's an amazing collection though. Like I think there's something.
Well, I think it's everything about him. It strikes at his very being what is going on. It's about immigration. It's about LGBT rights. It's about being different, and actually the thing that we're missing on this is the soundtrack, which was amazing, which was, it was kind of somewhere over the rainbow. It was, and it was all sung by a choir.
And then at the end, we are family.
We are family. And he said he wanted to have the London gay choir.
Gay men's chorus.
Gay
Oh my
men's
God,
choir.
they're
And
amazing.
he's saying,
I've
he
seen them
did
perform
actually
live.
think about getting them in there, but he
They're
said he
amazing.
didn't really
They're
think there'd be enough
huge.
room.
I've seen them perform live.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
What, I think there's loads of them, or they're just
there's
they're
so
massive.
many of them. Yeah, you can get like less of them. But no, my friend Ianthe, I'm going to give it a shout out. She runs a thing called the Robert Grace Trust, which is an HIV charity, and she does a choral concert every year, and they perform, and they're amazing.
Right. Oh,
Love
let's
them.
have a little moment to listen.
And what was, I thought, also really incredible about this, because it had all of those elements that you just said, being really political, being really something that is coming from the heart, but also these elements of the collection, every single piece was absolutely Ashish.
Yeah,
you
it
could
was
see
amazing.
is Ashish, and you could see over the trajectory of the last 10 seasons that this is something, the silhouettes, the whole, being able to make something that is actually not the easiest material to work with, so fluid, so beautiful, so easily wearable. And yeah, there were pieces there that you know are also so hugely wearable, and it's going to sell, and it's going to have a great lifetime to it as well, because those pieces are now, but they're also quite timeless. You can, you're going to be wearing those pieces.
Yeah, you're never going to look at that and
consistency.
think, well, that was very 2017, apart from the slogan aspect.
No. And like glitter, I mean, my little kind of like,
Pay
just to pay tribute to Ashish, a little bit of glitter. And, this skirt is over 20 years old. It's
but you
uniform.
still like it.
Little, a duo from London from however long ago. So yes, I think glitter is sustainability. It never goes out of fashion.
Should we give him a round of applause?
Yay!